move to our next speaker, which is Steve Young. So, Steve, he's MD of ICDP, and they do quite a lot of research on dealer models, distribution, the whole change in this automotive world. And Steve, welcome. Hope
Thanks,
you're okay.
Johan. Good afternoon, everyone.
And the last time that we spoke, you basically were as a speaker at the first remarketing forum ever in, I think, 2014 in Hamburg. So
Absolutely, in Hamburg, yes.
it's
I
a long
remember it.
time ago that you've been with us, but very happy to have you here because, of course, you are focused a lot on all of those changes like HSC model, and because they will have a change, a different in how used cars basically are handled. So happy to see your view on this. So you can share the screen and then it's all yours.
Okay. Yes, thanks, Johan, and it's good to be back with Fleet Europe. For those who don't know ICDP, and some of you may actually be employed by member companies but not know it, then just a little bit of an introduction. How do I advance this given that it's your presentation? Okay, so the title is of the presentation, Implication of Changes in the Manufacturer Business Model. Johan and Mark have already sort of referred to that a little bit. We're just going to a bit more depth on some of the individual elements of that. So as I said, a brief introduction first about ICDP. We have been running a collaborative research program for almost 30 years. So focused on Europe, but we have a good network elsewhere around the world. And collaborative in the sense that we have members from across the industry, which gives us great insights to all the different perspectives. So it's not based on just, either the manufacturer or the dealer or a manufacturer. It's across the piece and includes a number of service providers and so on. And then around that, we have consultancy, typically related to taking the generic results of the research, making it specific to a client, and some data services. But what we're trying to do is to help our members navigate their way ahead over the next 5 years to 10 years, hence the little sort of rally image in the background. Moving on to the next one, the members themselves, as I said, from across the industry, most of the manufacturers sitting across the top end, including some who are either new to Europe or new full stop, or having a rebirth like Lotus. Some of the big distributors and dealer groups, many of whom, as you will know, have their own fleet and leasing operations, and then a range of players from the aftermarket and service and technology providers, trade associations. So that's the breadth of the membership, the breadth of the contacts that we have on a day-to-day level, and therefore the platform on which my comments are made. So to start off, we've never had it so good, was an expression from a British Prime Minister 60 years ago, talking about the economy at that time. We could say the same thing about the auto industry sort of globally, really, that the manufacturers and the dealers are having a great time, and that's not what we would have expected if we look back 2 years when we were just going into the first 1 or 2 months of lockdown and pandemic restrictions, and dealerships were closed, factories were stopped, and so on. But just with the selection of headlines that you see there, then the profit levels are high. Also true for the dealer groups, and we're all familiar with the reasons for that. That the chip shortages mean that there's restricted supply, and basically any product can be sold at list. And some of this crazy upside down world where younger used cars can be selling for a higher price than the list price of the new car. So it is sort of total madness in that respect. If we move on to the next, so we're going through that experience, and it'd be nice to say, and you have some commentators who say, oh well, now we've all learned the lessons, then we won't go back. But we have been here before in one sense. So in the late 90s into the period up until the financial crisis, really, there was quite a move in Europe, advocated to a large extent by ICDP, but I was also involved in it on the manufacturer side, sort of in parallel to that. So there was it was a general trend towards getting a better balance between supply and demand, and that the basic elements of that. And so I worked on what was called customer order fulfillment in General Motors across a number of markets, but there were a number of other projects, Projet Nouvelle Distribution at Renault, for example, others that you might be familiar with if you were around at that time. The basic principles were always the same. You centralize the stock by having the stock in one location available to all of the dealers. Then you can do a much better job of stock planning, order generation, order management, and it allows you to reduce the stock but improve the mix within that. That gives you better availability for the customers. It avoids having aged stock where someone's ended up with an unusual specification in a particular location. They don't have a customer for it, and it sits there until the manufacturer puts some money behind it in variable marketing. It means that you don't have lost sales, and the customers can get the car that they want rather than being disappointed or being forced into a car that's not really the specification they want, but with a discount. And so the overall result of it all is a richer mix. So it's lower cost, lower capital, better customer satisfaction, generally shorter lead times. What's not to like? But after the financial crisis, when money became free, in the sense of very, very low interest rates and a panic to try and get whatever salespeople could in the post-financial crisis period, then those lessons were forgotten. So we've been here before, we've forgotten the lessons in the past. Will we do better this time? And my concern, and it goes to the poll that Johan just put up, is that we will see a situation where the supply constraints are eased at different paces for different manufacturers. And so some manufacturers will have better supply than others. And against, unfulfilled demand in the marketplace, then they will supply against that demand. They and their dealers will still be getting full margin, so it will look like good quality business, but their market share will clearly go up. There'll be a land grab by those brands that have free supply. And when their competitors get back into a situation where they have availability, then they will obviously want to win that market share back. And we will then get into the situation where it's business as usual, everyone's fighting, discounting, and so on. So I think that's a serious risk. I wouldn't put it better than 50-50 that we will actually carry on with supply being managed against demand as opposed to being managed against some notion of production efficiency. We go on to the next one. The manufacturers also face other challenges. So again, Mark's talked about some of this a little bit, but there's a few other points based here, and we'll go through each of these in turn. The first one is how they handle electrification. The second is around omni-channel, and within that, that includes agency, which Johan just referred to in the introduction. There's the threat from newcomers, new brands coming into the market. We're not talking about so much the niche players like Lotus or Ineos that you saw on that earlier members list, but in particular the Chinese brands. And we would also have to, I think, to consider Tesla as a newcomer in this context, although clearly they've been around for 10 years now. Regulation, both at the European level, but also locally, and then how they handle legacy. So let's just go through each of those in turn, because all of them have sort of used car impacts. The first one, in terms of electrification, basically it drives up the costs and it reduces the margin. And that's sort of pretty much all the way through the value chain, whether we're talking about new cars, used cars, or after sales. The margin compression has come about because the products themselves have a higher manufacturing cost, particularly related to the battery element of it. And the manufacturers have chosen to a certain extent to price to market rather than sort of on a cost plus basis, otherwise it'd be uncompetitive. And so the margins have been compressed for the dealers. And although the product costs are going down, I'm afraid that I'm a little bit of a cynic and do not anticipate they will then say, oh, we've managed to make a saving of 5% or 10% on the battery, so let's go back to a 10% margin on the BEV. You know, we've gone down that route. The dealers have been forced to accept it. It's not going to come back. And we also have to acknowledge that the BEVs themselves are still significantly more expensive than an IC car. Supply running ahead of demand, I would anticipate that this could run with some variation from year to year for quite a few years. We're not just talking about a temporary situation. At the moment, obviously, we're supply constrained, but if we look beyond the issues around chips, then the manufacturers have a need to hit certain emissions levels as a fleet average, and the customers still have some concerns about price, about the technology, about charging infrastructure, about whether it fits their lifestyle, and so on. So even in this environment of constrained supply, there are examples of manufacturers who are forcing BEVs out into the marketplace. And I think that will continue in the next few years until eventually we're into a cycle where customers are more comfortable with BEVs. They've had experience of one or two in many cases, and the charging infrastructure is caught up with the product. The tech evolution is already affecting the appeal of the used car, and I think that will become more complex in the future. So with the current technology, then a battery warranty of say 7 or 8 years typically. Then a 6-year-old car, 6-year-old BEV, when it's sold, if it's sold with say 3-year finance, then that's taking it past the end of the warranty. And although the batteries in general are surviving better than was anticipated or feared, the potential is there for someone to end up buying a car. It's maybe gone through more high rapid charging cycles than another car, and the battery fails, and the RV of that car is not X, but perhaps a tenth of X, or even potentially an economic write-off. So as we go forward and the performance is improving and the used car starts to look less and less attractive by comparison with the improving performance of new cars, then we get solid state batteries coming along potentially in 3 or 4 years time, which have a completely different performance profile. Then there'll continue to be instability in the used cars. And extending the manufacturer involvement with individual cars helps to address some of those things. So you can look at your initial support, financial support to the deal, but extend it not over one user in 3 years, but perhaps over two users and three users out to 6 or 8 years. And so there's certainly discussion about that, and you see a little bit more activity as well happening. And I would expect that to increase, that we'll see the manufacturers more involved in leasing used cars through the captive, where any support they put in is not transparent to the end customer or to the market. And that clearly affects the availability of used cars. If we then move on to the next point about omni-channel, this forces restructuring, forces digitalization. It's not optional in our view. You know, customers expect omni-channel. We've been doing our own consumer research now for 10 years, and you know, the number of dealer visits is actually going up, not down. Customers are willing to travel further to get to a dealer, and the majority of customers, over 90% of customers, want to use dealers at some point in their journey, but not necessarily all at the same point. So it's not simply a question of providing test drive centers, for example, which you cannot do online. But some of them want to do the deal in the dealership, some want to sign it off at home. Some want to have a test drive at home, some want to have a test drive at the dealership, and so on. So we have to give them the flexibility. If you try to go down the route of being an online only channel for new cars, it would not work. You would fail. You'd be missing a huge part of the market. But we need to get cost out because we need to invest in digital. Therefore, we need to get some cost out of physical. And that sort of transition to smaller, leaner networks and more investment in fully capable digital channels is something that we're starting to see, but progress is slower than it needs to be. The manufacturers inevitably get more involved in retail, and dealers understand this. If you look at connected cars, you look at cars that are being sold with service plans through the manufacturer captive for leasing, then all of those things say the manufacturer will be more involved in retail. Over-the-air updates, no dealer wants to have the responsibility for making sure that over-the-air updates are rolled out and properly implemented in a safe way, and so on. So the manufacturer will be more involved, and it's just a question of where the boundary is. It doesn't inevitably include agency. You can make omni-channel work if you modify the terms of an existing franchise format, franchise agreement. You can still get the price compression, the transparency of data, towards the seamless journey. Agency gives you that bit more, and manufacturers in general, not all of them, tend to like the idea of being more involved. They think they know about retail. Most of them don't, and they want to get involved in the with the customers, the retailing of the cars. So we will doubtless see more agency, and that affects used cars because under agency, the sort of default, if you like, is that because the manufacturer is issuing the invoice to the customer, they're proposing the deal, they're setting the price, they're setting the finance terms. If there's a trade-in car, they need also to take that into account and put the value on it. But interestingly, the manufacturers that we speak to in general are more scared about being involved in used cars, trade-in cars, than they are about the challenges they will face with free supply of managing dynamic pricing and doing the quotes for the customer. So they tend to shy away from it, and they're come up with mechanisms to do back-to-back deals so that the cars immediately pass through to the handling dealer rather than ending up on their balance sheet for a prolonged period of time and them actually trading the used cars. But there will be a higher penetration of manufacturer finance, we believe, and so those cars will be coming back as defleet from the captives park and then again sold out. So we can see some changes potentially there. But whichever way it happens, agency will affect the used car market. If we look at the new market entrants, so thinking about people like Xpeng, NIO, Li Auto, BYD Europe, who are now here and now members of the program, then they bring fresh thinking. They have no legacy back in their domestic market. They have no legacy here. And so, there is a positive aspect to them coming along with sort of new approaches. And we've already seen that a little bit with Airways, who took a small player, but took a very different approach to the market in terms of both sales and after sales and the service intervals. In Norway, Xpeng and NIO have gone in with sort of direct to agency models. So they are taking a different approach, and that will help to bring a bit more variety to the whole distribution scene. We don't see them as presenting an existential risk, so you're not going to see Volkswagen knocked out of the market by Xpeng. But you could certainly see some brands like MG putting pressure on some of the smaller players in the market, like say Suzuki, who I would argue are in broadly the same market space. They're more likely to use direct channels, as I mentioned. They're more likely to innovate in own versus use. You see that with Link, for example, trying to promote subscription as a primary way of accessing Link. And they will want to manage RVs because that's part of their brand value, if you like. And in general, they want to maintain the customer relationship over time. That's also part of their model. We go on to the next slide. The regulation, it forces change, obviously. The whole electrification is not something that the industry has chosen to do. It's been forced on the industry by EU regulation, both in terms of, broadly in terms of the technology and definitely in terms of the timing and the volumes and the pace of switchover. But also at the local level, we've got individual cities who are establishing their own rules around urban access for ICE, so in Paris or Brussels or Stuttgart, London, and so on. And so that might influence the urban park mix and also then encourage some churn within the existing park of people being forced to sell their cars and acquire a different type of car in order to continue to have access to the area around where they live. And so that's going to create some local market distortions. And then if we go on to the final element, then in parallel to all of this, they've got enough on the to-do list already, you would argue, with those sort of 4 areas, but they still have, all the existing manufacturers still have an existing legacy in terms of their investment, their capabilities, their people, their suppliers and their dealer partners, and the whole way of thinking, the whole culture. And so they will need to do a number of things. So what we can expect to see are strategies that extend the reach of the business. So to try and get as much money as they can for as long as they can from that legacy, then how do you, reach out into older cars? How do you maintain the after sales business even while that's in structural decline and the new cars are not generating a great deal of after sales business? Transitions in relationships from old to new. So how do they move forward? How do they in a way which does not damage the brand and lose customers, how do they concentrate their distribution focus, for example, and move forward. They've got too much infrastructure. What's involved in that? What are the costs of that? How does that affect the part supply of parts that may be made in those factories, and so on? Manufacturers, as a rule of thumb, make half of their total profit from parts. So if they start to lose control of that, then that is a huge issue for them. And they need to get in their mindset, whether it's agency or whether it's a modified franchise, they need to become retailers, and they're not. They are wholesalers. They are to some extent traders. They're not retailers, and you need to have that mindset, that connection to the end market, and be much more dynamic and faster thinking in terms of how they react to that. We go on to the next one. So, in combination, then, that's a sort of a challenge for the manufacturers. They want to get tighter control of the used cars, say up to 8 years old, in the manufacturer franchise dealer world. That's because of the RV issue, and it's also because of trying to maintain the after sales business for as long as they can within the franchise world, to avoid weakening both their own business model as the part supplier and the dealer's business model as a trader in the parts and the related labor. We touched on this, or Mark and Johan touched on it earlier on in Mark's presentation and the subsequent discussion. We anticipate high growth of leasing. We don't see much in the way of sort of by the kilometer or by the minute mobility. We don't think that's a substantial sector in the future, but customers are willing to buy a car as a bundle of the car and the service and perhaps the insurance and so on. And that means that the driver has little influence over where they take it for service or for crash repair, or ultimately where and how they dispose of it. So whilst trade-ins might be an issue for manufacturers moving to agency now, it will actually become a declining issue in the future, because more and more of the cars will have been initially sold on a lease, and they'll come back to the manufacturer at the end of that lease. That puts more pressure on the manufacturers and the dealers to, as I've said it here, eat what they kill. So what they sell new, they're going to have to dispose of as a used car in 3 years' time, or if what they're selling is a leased 3-year-old car, they need to dispose of in 6 years' time. So they need to be much more cautious about how they manage that. Think about it as fleet managers and not as wholesalers or retailers, where it's not their problem afterwards. And all of that's going to lock up the supply of those used cars up to, say, 8 years old, and put much more pressure on independent used car channels in terms of sourcing and so on, because there's not going to be the same number of cars that are in free supply in the market. So
okay.
Yeah.
That's probably the summary, Steve. Good.
Yeah.
I think a lot of challenges for all parties, and we had some great questions which we will take a bit later in the panel, because Steve, we will see you back within, let's say, an hour and a half in the panel where we add the discussion on the sourcing as well. But this is a good a basis certainly on the changes. So thanks a lot for your input here. I'm gonna have a look whether I can share the voting results. I will get them on my screen in a second, and then I will share them, and then I will get the next speaker in. Philip, I will get in. So Steve, I will see you a bit later again in the panel. Thanks a lot for your input. Thanks.